At exactly midnight on August 19th, a 50% tariff was set to slam into roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods crossing into the United States. Milk, plywood, beer, even hockey sticks. And as that deadline closed in, Canadian trade officials were still camped out in Washington, trying to stop it. This is not a hypothetical. This is not old news being recycled. This is happening right now, in real time. And the man at the center of it, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, has just told the world again that he will not blink. For more than a year, Carney has repeated one line so often that it has become something close to a doctrine. Canada will not accept a bad deal. He said it after meeting with the country's premiers. He has said it in French and in English in Ottawa and in Washington, in front of cameras and behind closed doors. And according to Bloomberg, the promise is now being tested harder than at any point since he took office, because Donald Trump does not appear to be bluffing this time, and neither, it seems, does Carney. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand how we got here. Because this is not a fight that started this month. It started more than a year and a half ago, and it has been building, deadline by deadline, threat by threat, ever since. Back when Donald Trump returned to the White House for his second term, he did something almost no American president before him had done to Canada. He didn't just talk tariffs, he talked annexation. Repeatedly, publicly, and without much apparent concern for how it would land north of the border, Trump floated the idea that Canada should simply become the 51st state of the United States. According to CBC News, Trump raised the idea directly with Carney during a phone call in late March of last year, and then kept raising it again and again in interviews and press briefings, even in the Oval Office itself. Carney's answer never wavered. Never. Absolutely not never, he told reporters, according to Yahoo News and Investing, Com's reporting on his campaign remarks. He went further, warning Canadians in blunt language that the stakes were about national survival, not just trade numbers. The Americans want to break us, they can own us, Carney said at the time. Those aren't just words, that's what's at risk. Whether you agree with that framing or not, it worked politically. Carney rode a wave of what Canadians started calling elbows up sentiment, a slogan borrowed from hockey, meaning don't back down, protect yourself, play physical if you have to, straight into the Prime Minister's office. Trump's talk of the 51st state, intended or not, helped elect the very leader who has spent the past 16 months refusing to give him what he wants. But sovereignty threats were only half the story. The other half was tariffs, and those have followed a brutal, escalating rhythm. Early in the trade war, Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automobiles under what's known as Section 232 of U.S. trade law, a national security provision that lets the president restrict imports he deems a threat to American industry. Those sectoral tariffs have remained in place through round after round of negotiations, and according to Brian Clough, who worked on trade files under Carney's predecessor Justin Trudeau, they are now the single biggest obstacle to any final agreement. This is going to come down to the U. Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles, Clough told Bloomberg. The 232s have to get close to zero, especially for automobile trade, where the margins are so low. There's another layer to this fight that most casual coverage skips entirely, and it actually explains a lot of why August has become such a pressure point. Under the terms of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement itself, the three countries were legally required to conduct what's called a joint review on the 6th anniversary of the deal taking effect, which fell on July 1st of this year. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative's own published statement, the three parties met virtually that day, and the United States, through Ambassador Jamieson Greer, said plainly that it did not agree to renew the agreement in its current form. As Greer put it in the official USTR statement, the USMCA is not renewed. Mexico and Canada, by contrast, both confirmed their support for extending the deal for another 16 years, according to reporting from the law firm White & Case, which tracks trade policy closely. So, heading into the August 19th deadline, Canada isn't just negotiating over a single tariff threat. It's negotiating inside a broader trade agreement that the United States has already formally declined to renew as written. That doesn't mean the agreement collapses. Under its own terms, according to White & Case's analysis, it stays in force through 2036, regardless, shifting instead into a cycle of annual reviews, unless the parties reach a different arrangement. But it does mean the ground underneath these tariff negotiations is shifting at the same time the tariffs themselves are escalating, which is part of why Canadian officials have been treating this moment as more consequential than a routine trade dispute. Canada's response to that same review, according to Canada U. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc was to reaffirm its priorities directly to Washington. LeBlanc stated after the joint review meeting that the parties agreed on the importance of continuing our discussions, and he confirmed that Canada's central priority remains addressing U.S. sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber. the same list of sticking points that Brian Clough flagged as the core obstacle to any final deal. Earlier this year, in April, Carney also stood up a new advisory committee on Canada-EU. Economic Relations, chaired by LeBlanc, specifically to give the government expert input on how to navigate this relationship as it entered its most volatile stretch yet. The scale of what's at stake in these talks is difficult to overstate. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the trade agreement underpinning all of this covers a market of more than 500 million people and accounts for roughly 30% of global GDP, with goods and services trade across the three countries totaling close to $2 trillion in the most recent full year on record. That's the backdrop against which a fight over hockey sticks and plywood tariffs is actually unfolding. Not an isolated squabble, but one flashpoint inside a continental economic relationship worth trillions of dollars a year. Then came August 1st of this year. Ahead of a deadline Trump had already delayed once. From July 9th, he signed an executive order raising the tariff rate on Canadian imports that don't comply with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, known as CUSMA, from 25% up to 35%. Global News covered the fallout live, bringing in UBC political science professor Max Cameron to explain what it meant for a government that had, just days earlier, insisted it would not roll over. Carney's government called the move disappointing. It was also, by that point, entirely expected. Trump had told reporters plainly, weeks before, "We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where they'll just pay tariffs. It's not really a negotiation." That comment alone tells you something important about how the American side has approached these talks. And it sets up exactly why the current standoff, the one building toward August 19th, matters so much more than the ones that came before it. Here is where the story turns urgent. According to reporting this month from the Bloomberg News Service and corroborated by Transport Topics and Radio Canada, the Trump administration gave Canada an ultimatum. Either Carney's government addresses a long list of what the White House calls trade irritants, or the United States moves forward on August 19th with a 50% tariff on a swath of Canadian exports worth roughly $20 billion, a list that, according to NBC News reporting from just this week, includes hockey sticks, certain clothing categories, wine, some dairy products, and building materials like cement and plywood. Canadian negotiators didn't sit still. Sources briefed on the talks told Bloomberg that trade officials from Ottawa spent days essentially living in Washington, trying to hammer out a preliminary deal before the clock ran out. On Tuesday of that week, according to people familiar with the matter on both sides of the border, the Americans floated a new proposal, one that would lower some of the sectoral tariffs, but according to Canadian officials, not nearly enough. As of Monday, just one day before the deadline, CBC News reported that the two sides were still, in its word, at an impasse. Speaking to reporters that same day, Carney described the negotiations as very delicate and intense. He confirmed he intended to speak directly with Trump before the deadline hit, a phone call that, depending on how it goes, could either produce a last-minute breakthrough or confirm that both sides are prepared to let the tariffs land. And this is the moment where the red line in this story becomes concrete, not just rhetorical. According to Bloomberg, Canada's top trade negotiator warned American counterparts directly that if the White House goes ahead with new tariffs on August 19th, it would represent what she called a cliff, a moment so damaging to the relationship that it risks halting negotiations altogether, not just delaying them. That's not a minor procedural warning. That's Ottawa telling Washington, cross this threshold and you may not get a seat back at the table anytime soon. At the same time, the American side has made clear it isn't interested in Canada pushing back if the tariffs do land. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, touring a tire facility in Des Moines, Iowa on August 14th, told reporters the administration will not tolerate retaliation from Canada. "For us, this is not a trade war," Greer said, according to CBC News and Radio Canada's coverage of the same remarks. "But we have domestic supply chains we're trying to protect. It's not Canada-specific. We're doing this globally. If a country retaliates against us, we're not going to tolerate that. We'll take action." That's a striking thing for a senior U.S. trade official to say out loud on the record days before a deadline. It's essentially a warning shot aimed squarely at Ottawa. Don't fight back, or there will be consequences beyond the tariffs already on the table. Greer added, according to the same CBC report, that Trump and Carney would be given options ahead of the deadline, and that a potential path forward could be presented to the president as early as the Monday before the cutoff. So where does that leave Carney? Caught, according to multiple reports, between two forces that are pulling in opposite directions. On one side, there's the Canadian business community. Goldie Hyder, CEO of the Business Council of Canada, has been pushing Carney to close a deal with Trump, warning that continued uncertainty is bad for investment and bad for jobs. A report from the Canadian American Business Council, cited by Retail Insider Canada, estimated that a full breakdown of the U.S.-Canada trade relationship could cost Canada as many as 102,000 jobs. On the other side, there's Canadian public opinion, and according to a survey from the Angus Reid Institute, it is not subtle. 62% of Canadians say they want Carney to hit the United States with retaliatory tariffs if Trump follows through on the 50% threat. Only 19% want to take retaliation off the table entirely, and just 7% say Canada should offer up further concessions to avoid a fight. Eric Miller, founder of the Rideau Potomac Strategy Group, a trade and economic consultancy that tracks these negotiations closely, put it bluntly to Bloomberg, if Trump goes ahead with it, Carney will have to do something. The public is just angry. The public is kind of done. This is, in a very real sense, the defining tension of Carney's premiership so far. He came into office as a technocrat with a reputation for careful, unemotional decision-making, built over years running 2 G7 central banks through periods of genuine crisis. That reputation is now being tested in a completely different arena, one governed less by monetary policy models and more by political theater, public anger, and a negotiating partner who has shown a consistent preference for maximum pressure over quiet diplomacy. Whether Carney's instincts as a former central banker help or hurt him here is genuinely an open question among Canadian political analysts, some of whom argue his caution is exactly what's needed to avoid a self-inflicted economic wound, and others who argue the moment calls for the kind of forceful public pushback that made elbows up resonate with voters in the first place. That's the political reality Carney is operating inside. Roll over, and he risks a domestic backlash that could define the rest of his time in office. Retaliate hard, and he risks the kind of escalation that Greer has already promised the U.S. will not tolerate. It's a genuinely narrow path, and according to people briefed on the negotiations, Canadian officials have told Greer's team directly that they cannot accept a deal that forces Canada to make concessions without getting real movement on the Section 232 tariffs in return. Bloomberg reported that Canadian officials view any deal seen as a unilateral cave, without matching relief on autos and metals, as politically impossible given, in their words, the Canadian public mood. It's worth taking a moment to explain, in concrete terms, what a 50% tariff on this list of goods would actually mean for the businesses and workers involved, because the number itself can sound abstract until you attach it to real products. A 50% duty on Canadian plywood means American builders and retailers importing that plywood pay half again its value in tax at the border, a cost that typically gets passed down the chain to construction firms and eventually to home buyers. A 50% duty on dairy products layered on top of Canada's already tightly managed supply system creates friction on both sides of the border, since Canadian dairy exporters lose competitiveness in the American market precisely when they might otherwise be looking to diversify away from it. Hockey sticks, small as that category sounds in a headline, represent a genuine slice of Canadian manufacturing, concentrated in specific communities where sporting goods production is a real employer. The point isn't that any single item on that list is enormous by itself. It's that the list was chosen, according to the reporting from NBC News and Bloomberg, specifically to cover roughly $20 billion in trade, meaning it was built to be big enough to hurt without necessarily touching the largest and most politically explosive categories, like autos and energy, which remain governed separately under the Section 232 tariffs. That distinction matters because it shows how layered this trade fight actually is. Canada isn't dealing with one tariff. It's dealing with several overlapping tariff regimes running at the same time. The general CUSMA-linked rate that jumped from 25 to 35% on August 1st for non-compliant goods, the sector-specific Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles that have been in place for well over a year, and now this additional 50% threat aimed at a separate basket of roughly $20 billion in goods, set to land on August 19th if no deal is reached. Each of these has its own legal basis, its own political history, and its own set of Canadian industries lobbying for relief. Untangling all three at once in a matter of days is part of why Canadian negotiators have described these talks as uniquely difficult, even by the standards of a trade relationship that has been under strain since Trump's second term began. It's worth pausing here to note that this isn't the first time Carney has tried to lower the temperature unilaterally. Back in August of last year, Carney's government announced it would remove Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods that comply with CUSMA, a goodwill gesture aimed at showing Washington that Ottawa wasn't interested in prolonging the fight for its own sake. Global News covered the announcement, noting it drew a mixed reaction domestically. Some saw it as pragmatic. Others saw it as giving something away for nothing in return. That decision is part of the backdrop against which the current standoff is playing out. Carney has already shown a willingness to de-escalate when he believed it served Canada's interests. The question now is whether he's willing to do the opposite if Trump forces his hand. There's also a provincial dimension to this fight that rarely makes American headlines, but matters enormously inside Canada. Trade policy touches different provinces in very different ways, and that's complicating Carney's room to maneuver. In Quebec, Premier Christine Fréchette has been pushing for reduced tariffs, specifically on aluminum, a major Quebec export, without giving away significant concessions on dairy, a politically sensitive sector protected for decades under Canada's supply management system. A spokesperson for Fréchette told reporters the province continues to defend Quebec's economic interests in the context of what she called the ongoing trade war. Meanwhile, in Ontario, Premier Doug Ford has repeatedly urged Carney not to roll over, telling reporters in earlier rounds of the dispute, "I wouldn't roll over. I told the Prime Minister, fight back as hard as we possibly can. We're going to win this thing one way or another." Alberta's position adds another wrinkle entirely, since the province's energy exports operate under a different set of rules and exposures than the steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs dominating headlines elsewhere. Energy has periodically come up in Trump's own rhetoric toward Canada, including past comments about fertilizer tariffs that alarmed agricultural producers on both sides of the border. While energy was not the central focus of the reporting reviewed for this specific August 19th deadline, its presence in the broader relationship is part of why any final CUSMA-linked settlement will likely need to address more than just the handful of sectors currently making headlines. Trade negotiators rarely get to solve one problem in isolation when the underlying agreement covers nearly every category of cross-border commerce at once. Goldie Hyder summed up the underlying tension well. "It underscores the difficulty of governing our country as a federation," he said, describing the challenge of building a national negotiating position when provinces have such different economic exposure to different American tariffs. Steel-heavy Ontario, aluminum-heavy Quebec, dairy-protected regions across the country, energy-exporting Alberta, and they don't all want the same thing from Washington, and Carney has to represent all of them at once while sitting across the table from an American president who has shown little patience for nuance. Now, let's be precise about what is confirmed and what is not, because that distinction matters enormously in a story moving this fast. It is confirmed, from multiple named sources including Bloomberg, CBC, NBC News, and Radio Canada, that the August 19th deadline is real, that 50% tariffs on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods are the concrete threat on the table, and that, as of the most recent reporting, no final deal had been reached. It is confirmed that Carney has repeatedly and publicly said Canada will not accept what he calls a bad deal. It is confirmed that USTR Jamieson Greer has said the U.S. will not tolerate Canadian retaliation. What is not yet confirmed, because it hadn't happened at the time of the most recent reporting, is whether the 50% tariff actually takes effect, what any last-minute deal might contain, or how Carney would respond if the tariffs do land. Some of the detail on ongoing internal negotiating positions comes from sources described only as people familiar with the matter, or people briefed on the negotiations, a common and legitimate journalistic practice for sensitive trade talks, but it does mean those specific details carry a slightly lower level of certainty than statements made on the record, like Greer's comments in Des Moines or Carney's public remarks to reporters. It's also worth being honest about the broader context Trump has placed this fight in. Greer's insistence that it's not Canada-specific, we're doing this globally, reflects a pattern that's shown up throughout Trump's second term, a preference for using tariffs as leverage across dozens of trading partners simultaneously, not just against Canada. Fox News reported that back in July of last year, Trump made similar deadline threats to the European Union, Japan, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom, among others, framing all of it as part of a broader effort to rebalance American trade relationships. Canada is a major piece of that puzzle, given the sheer scale of cross-border commerce between the two countries, but it is not, according to the administration's own framing, being singled out. Whether that framing holds up under scrutiny, particularly given how personally Trump has approached the relationship with Carney, and how often he's returned to talk of Canadian statehood, is something reasonable observers can disagree on. It's also worth noting that Trump's willingness to describe using military force against Canada, even hypothetically, sets this relationship apart from almost every other trading partner facing similar tariff pressure. Asked directly by NBC's Kristen Welker whether he would consider military force to annex Canada, Trump said he didn't think we're not going to ever get to that point, but added, in the same breath, that something could happen with Greenland, a comment that did little to reassure Canadian officials watching the exchange. No credible reporting reviewed for this story suggests military action is an active consideration inside the current negotiations over the August 19th deadline. But that history is part of why Canadian public opinion around these tariff talks runs hotter than it might for a purely economic dispute between two ordinary trading partners. Domestically, the political fallout of all this has also reshaped how Canadians talk about their own economy. The Buy Canadian movement that emerged alongside Elbows Up sentiment has pushed some retailers to relabel domestic products more prominently and has, according to multiple Canadian outlets covering consumer trends, measurably shifted purchasing patterns for some grocery and retail categories, even if the precise national scale of that shift is harder to quantify with a single citable figure. What is measurable is the polling. The Angus Reid findings on retaliation preferences aren't a one-off snapshot either. They reflect a pattern of sustained frustration that has shown up in survey after survey since the tariff fight began, reinforcing why Carney has so little room to simply accept whatever terms Washington puts forward. So what happens next? If Carney and Trump do not reach an agreement before the deadline, the 50% tariffs take effect on the list of goods already reported by NBC News and other outlets. Canadian officials have signaled, through their own on-the-record statements, that they view this scenario as a serious escalation, not simply the continuation of the status quo. Whether Canada responds with its own retaliatory tariffs, something a clear majority of Canadians say they want, according to that Angus Reid polling, or whether Carney tries once more to hold the line diplomatically while absorbing the economic hit, is genuinely unclear as of the most recent reporting. Eric Miller's assessment that Carney will have to do something reflects the political pressure building on him domestically, but it is his own analysis as a trade consultant, not a confirmed plan from the Prime Minister's office. If a deal is reached instead, the core sticking points, according to every source reviewed for this story, will almost certainly involve some meaningful movement on the Section 232 tariffs, covering steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Brian Clow's assessment that those tariffs need to get close to zero for a deal to be politically viable in Canada lines up with what Canadian officials have reportedly told their American counterparts directly. Anything short of that, multiple sources suggest, risks being seen domestically as exactly the kind of bad deal Carney has spent over a year promising he would never accept. It's also useful to place this specific standoff inside the wider pattern of how Trump has handled trade deadlines throughout his second term, because Ottawa is not the only capital that has lived through this dynamic. Fox News reported that the same August 1st deadline structure that hit Canada was applied, around the same period, to a long list of other trading partners, including the European Union, Japan, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom. Trump reached agreements with several of those partners before their respective deadlines arrived, agreements that, according to CBC News, reporting on Carney's own comments, still included some level of tariff rather than eliminating them entirely. Carney himself acknowledged this pattern directly, telling reporters ahead of a cabinet meeting that there's not a lot of evidence right now that the U.S. is willing to cut a deal without some tariffs included, and noting that every agreement Trump had struck up to that point carried some tariff component. That matters for understanding Carney's negotiating posture. He is not, based on his own public comments, holding out for a tariff-free outcome. He's holding out for a deal where the remaining tariffs, particularly the Section 232 duties on autos, steel, and aluminum, are low enough that Canadian industry can still compete, rather than a deal that locks in the kind of double-digit or higher rates currently on the table. There's a broader lesson buried in all of this, beyond the specific tariff numbers and negotiating positions. This is a story about what happens when a long-standing alliance built over decades of deeply integrated trade gets tested by a fundamentally different approach to power. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world. They share supply chains that cross back and forth sometimes a dozen times before a finished product ever reaches a shelf. And yet, over the past year and a half, that relationship has been pushed to a place few analysts would have predicted even 3 years ago. Threats of annexation, tariffs reaching into the 30s and now potentially the 50s, and a Canadian Prime Minister whose entire political identity has become tied to the idea of not backing down. Carney didn't ask to become the face of Canadian resistance to American pressure. He was a central banker, first at the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, known for technocratic caution, not political combat. But circumstance and Trump's own rhetoric pushed him into that role, and he has leaned into it. Our objective is not to reach a deal whatever it costs, Carney told reporters earlier this year, according to the BBC. We are pursuing a deal that will be in the best interest of Canadians. That line, more than any slogan, may be the clearest statement of where his government's priorities actually sit. Whether that stance holds through August 19th and beyond, whether it produces a deal that genuinely protects Canadian industry, or whether it triggers the kind of tariff shock that reshapes the Canadian economy for years to come, is something only the coming days and weeks will answer. What's clear right now, based on everything confirmed in this reporting, is that Carney has planted a flag. He has told Trump, repeatedly, publicly, and as recently as this week, that Canada will not accept a bad deal, no matter how much pressure Washington applies. Whether Trump believes him, and whether Ottawa can actually make that promise hold when the deadline hits, is the question hanging over everything right now. There's one more dimension worth sitting with before we move to sourcing, because it explains why this particular deadline feels different from the ones that came before it, even to people who have followed this trade fight closely for over a year. Every previous flashpoint in this relationship, the initial tariff rollout, the July 9th delay, the August 1st increase to 35%, arrived with some ambiguity about what would actually happen when the date hit. This time, according to the reporting reviewed for this story, both sides have been unusually explicit about their positions heading into the deadline. Greer has said, on the record, that retaliation won't be tolerated. Canada's negotiator has said, according to Bloomberg's sourcing, that new tariffs would represent a cliff, risking a halt to talks altogether. Carney has said Canada will not accept a bad deal. None of these are the vague, non-committal statements that often precede a quiet, last-minute compromise. They read more like each side laying down a marker for its own domestic audience, which makes predicting the actual outcome harder, not easier. A negotiated resolution is still very possible. Deals of exactly this kind have come together in the final hours before past deadlines throughout Trump's second term. But the tone of the public statements in the days immediately before August 19th suggests neither government wants to be seen by its own public as the side that folded. Before we go further, it's worth naming exactly where this reporting comes from, so you can weigh it for yourself. The core deadline details and negotiating status are drawn from Bloomberg's reporting on August 13th, corroborated by Transport Topics' republication of that same wire content. The most recent update on the state of talks, describing them as at an impasse, comes from NBC News reporting published August 17th, which itself cites CBC News. USTR Jamieson Greer's on-the-record comments about not tolerating retaliation come from CBC News and Radio Canada's English language service, both reporting from his appearance in Des Moines, Iowa on August 14th. The Angus Reid Institute polling on Canadian public opinion regarding retaliation is cited within that same Bloomberg and Canadian Mortgage Trends reporting. Background on the August 1st tariff increase from 25 to 35% comes from Global News. Background on the 51st state comments and Carney's political rise comes from CBC News, Yahoo News Canada, Investing, Com, and Policy Magazine. The estimate of 102,000 potential job losses comes from a Canadian American Business Council report, as cited by Retail Insider Canada, where sources describe internal negotiating positions through unnamed officials that has been flagged throughout as less certain than on-the-record statements. Nothing in this account has been invented, and where the outcome of the August 19th deadline was not yet known at the time of research, it has been presented as unresolved rather than assumed. So here's the honest, open question at the heart of all this. If Washington follows through and the 50% tariffs hit on the 19th, should Carney retaliate the way most Canadians appear to want him to, even knowing the U.S. has explicitly warned it won't tolerate that? Or is there a smarter path that avoids escalation altogether, even if it means absorbing real economic pain in the short term? There's no obvious right answer here, and reasonable people on both sides of the border see this very differently. If you found this breakdown useful, the most helpful thing you can do is subscribe, because stories like this move fast, and there will be a direct follow-up the moment the deadline outcome is confirmed. If you have a take on how Carney should play this, drop it in the comments, because the range of opinion on this one, even inside Canada, is genuinely split, and that discussion is worth having. And if this kind of grounded, sourced breakdown of what's actually happening, instead of just headlines and hot takes, is something you want more of, hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one the moment new developments land. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back the moment there's confirmed news to bring you.